Welcome to our third program in our three-part series, Propaganda and Democracy. The last two sessions have focused on the history of propaganda, as well as the current rise of groups like Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Today, our esteemed group of panelists will be discussing what we communicators can do to counter all this disinformation and extremism. But first, let me thank and recognize our sponsors. The Grady School of Communications at the University of Georgia, Amazon, Page, the IW Group,
Kit Stinson and Richard Muldoon,
Muckrack, and of course, Compro. Now I'll turn the mic over to our MC today, Marek Posard of Rand Corporation.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody. My name is Mark Posard. I'm a military sociologist here at the Rand Corporation and a professor of policy analysis at the Party Rand Graduate School. And I'll be today's moderator. A little background about me very quickly. Most of my research has focused on election security, countering disinformation, and countering extremism in the US military. I'm also currently leading an effort with my colleagues Todd Helmus and Bill Marcelino called the Rand Democracy Project, where we're seeking to find pragmatic solutions to divisive policy issues that are acceptable to people from across the political spectrum. I'm delighted to welcome you to the final installment of a three-part symposium series on propaganda and democracy. The series seeks to explore how propaganda and disinformation have led to an increasingly divided America. For today, we will seek to better understand how communicators can help preserve democracy in three ways: countering propaganda, countering mis-dis and malinformation, and countering the rise of extremism. I just want to remind everyone before you forget to take a moment to register for this event on the Museum of Public Relations website if you haven't already. I'm excited that RAND is partnering with the Museum of Public Relations. I want to thank Shelley for all the hard work that she's been doing to help raise awareness about these important issues with our sponsors, as well as a broader constituency across the country and the world. Let me introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Our first panelist is a colleague of mine, Todd Helmus, who's a senior behavioral scientist at the Rand Corporation and a member of the Party Rand Graduate School faculty. Dr. Helmus specializes in disinformation, terrorism, and social media research. His latest research has focused on ways to counter Russian disinformation campaigns in the United States and Europe, as well as assessing the impact of international campaigns to counter violent extremism abroad. His research has also focused on preventing violent extremism in the US military, identifying ways to enlist key influencers in support of US strategic communications, and detecting and countering online conspiracy theories. Our second panelist is Mubin Sheikh. Mubin is currently a professor in the School of Public Safety at Seneca College and is a counter-extremism specialist for the NGO Parents for Peace, where he conducts research and directs interventions with radicalized and extremist individuals. Mr. Sheikh is a de-radicalized former extremist himself, turned undercover human source for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and police agent with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Integrated National Security Enforcement Team in Toronto. He has worked multiple infiltration operations, which remain classified to this day, as well as a 4-year public prosecution of the Toronto 18 terrorist cell. After this government and court experience, he was extensively involved with the infiltration of ISIS social media networks from 2012 to 2018 and remains intimately connected to this world today. Our last panelist is Dr. Ivanka Piashiva. Forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Ivanka. You can correct me in a moment. She's an associate professor at the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. Ivanka's primary area of research is media trust and credibility, and she has also studied international and cross-cultural communication, as well as general effects of digital media. She teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses, among which are credibility, the news media and public trust, public opinion, fake news, misinformation and propaganda, and multi-platform story production. Her scholarly work has been presented and won awards at national and international conferences, and she has been published in prominent peer-reviewed journals. Thank you all for being here today. So for today's discussion, we will start with a moderated portion and then move into a question and answer session. And the moderator portion will cover 3 questions. How do we counter extremism? What role does dis, and malinformation play in extremism? And what do we do about it? So for our first question, The focus is broadly speaking on how do we counter extremism? And we'll move to Mubin first. And perhaps Mubin, you could tell us more about Parents for Peace's efforts at countering extremism and related efforts to bring people back from extremism. Mubin?
Thank you very much, Merrick, and thank you, my co-panelists and all of you who have set this event up. Yeah, I'm with Parents for Peace as a counter-extremism specialist. We conduct these direct interventions with radicalized individuals. We actually have a helpline. You can see the website at parentsforpeace.org, where we approach this topic from a nonpartisan perspective, of course, and as well as covering the entire spectrum of extremist groups and extremist ideologies. I mean, even on the left, for example, we have one case of an individual. He was with, he was a self-identified Antifa member who actually absconded from the U.S. And went and joined the YPG in Syria. We have, former white supremacists who work with us and work alongside me. Individuals who in a previous life would have been an adversary, but today are my colleagues and my brother, as I call him, Chris Buckley, a military veteran, combat veteran in Afghanistan, whose friend was killed, came to hate Muslims, came back, transitioned out of the military, ended up being recruited by the KKK. And so this was a guy that we worked on, and we brought him back into the fold. And now he's my work colleague. We also work another individual, good friend of mine, Pardeep Kalika. His father and other Sikh members were murdered in the Oak Creek, Wisconsin Sikh temple shooting. He became a clinician, and he's been helping people, also come out of these groups. So we come with this holistic perspective. There is an intake process, of course. There's a peer support group that involves parents who are also involved. Because parents and families are, of course, at the front line of this, and able to see signs of individuals, who are radicalizing into either violence or otherwise. So this is the work that we do. It's the work that I do. We have high-profile intervention cases that are ongoing. Even now, we worked on some high-profile cases. For example, even the Wolverine militia case, the Governor Whitmer kidnapping case. One of those individuals was somebody that we worked with. He was an individual who pled guilty in the prosecution. So this is stuff that we're doing in real time, all the time.
So let's move on to some of the research. And Todd, you've recently completed a study where you were interviewing former violent extremists. Can you tell us more about the study and what some takeaways that you got from this work?
Sure, and thanks for having me here. And Mubin, please interject as well, because we worked with Parents for Peace on this, and I'd certainly be interested to hear about what you think some of your lessons learned were in that process. But I'll give you my 2 cents on it. We interviewed 36 former extremists and family and friends. Some of the folks that we talked about were sort of dead enders. They died in attacks or are sitting in jail. Others de-radicalized, disengaged from extremist groups, mostly white supremacy types, and they're out and about now. When we work with Parents for Peace to identify some of these people to interview, as well as another group called Beyond Barriers. I will say that one thing we learned is extremism, and tell me what you think about this, but extremism is a hard life. A lot of the folks that we talked to, before they ended up leaving, they sort of reached a point where they were disillusioned. They found that their groups were there was a lot of hypocrisy in the groups. They would rail on immigrants for their drug use, but then they would go and smoke pot and get loaded. There's a lot of infighting in these groups, the complaints about ineffectiveness and just exhaustion. I think just being a hateful person is a tiring experience. So that sort of set the stage for a lot of people to want to leave. But then how did they get out? For a lot of folks, it was interventions like what Parents for Peace are doing. About 2/3 of the folks that we talked to had interventions from life partners, an acquaintance, a friend, or oftentimes, and I'll talk more about this, from someone of a different race or ethnic group. And of course, there were a number of cases that had help from formal groups like Parents for Peace. And in all the cases, across most of the vast majority of cases, there was some combination of the following that really helped these people get out. One, a diverse cultural exposure to diverse cultural experience. And I'll give you an example of this. It's a very prominent example. It's a guy named Jeff Shupp, who is a former leader of the National Socialist Movement, I think. And he was this organizer of the Unite the Right rally. And he was approached by a journalist to film a documentary of his experiences. And this documentary was of Punjabi descent. So it's interesting, you have this brown person filming this documentary of the organization and the execution of the Unite the Right rally. Well, in the process of this, the guy builds a relationship with her. They become friends, and he sees that, you know, holy cow, all these lies I've been told are not our lies, are just that. And that sort of opened his mind to that experience. There's another guy named Daryl Davis, African-American, who has a cottage industry of befriending KKK people and bringing them out. So for a lot of people, it's exposure to these diverse experiences that are important. And for others, it's emotional support and kindness, financial and domestic stability. One thing we know that doesn't work is heavy-handed attempts, right? So trying to push people, force people into it, getting law enforcement involved, those types of heavy-handed efforts, according to a lot of folks we talked to, and they experienced a lot of these things, push them even further down the rabbit hole of extremism. So I don't know, I feel like it's a lesson in the value of relationships. It's a lesson in the value of forgiveness, of being able to provide, and also forgiveness and allowing people an opportunity to leave, and rewarding their leaving, right? Rather than continuing to hate them for the crimes or the sins that they've committed. So anyway, that was our observation.
Well, before I move on to Ivanka, I just want to see if Mubin has any follow-up in terms of lessons learned with working with Todd on this effort.
No, just really quickly, I don't want to take away from the other colleagues' times, of course, but a very important point that Todd just said about not taking the heavy-handed approach. I mean, I'll be honest, I myself even tried to do that, especially when I was dealing with ISIS members online. And, you know, aggression just begets more aggression. You really have to do almost this like jujitsu style of intervention where you have to just really stay silent in many cases. You can't even show visible facial reactions to some of the things that people say. And it really does come down to that relationship building and getting people on a one-on-one basis. The whole idea of law enforcement, I mean, obviously they have a role to play, but really what's going to really work and really help is going to be that personal relationship and that personal approach to individuals. I know we think, and I certainly thought this even in the beginning when I was doing this stuff, is that you have to like hammer them and you have to kind of go at them hard, and it's just not going to work. And even for those people, I'm actually in a case right now in Canada where there's a big domestic extremist group, and I won't mention their name, but one of the guys kind of reached out to me on Twitter by direct message saying like, hey, look, I want to get out of the group. And he hurt a lot of people, and he did, you know, create a thread. He made a thread on Twitter just apologizing and admitting to the things that he had done. But what I'm finding is a lot of the people who are kind of opposed or were opposed to him, or actually are still opposed to him, they're not taking it very kindly. You know, they want to take him to task. They want to make sure that he pays reparations to his victims, this and that. And again, like, I understand, obviously, the victim perspective is a very, very important aspect of any person's rehabilitation trajectory. But people have to also understand that if we make it impossible for them, then it's what's the point? I mean, they're going to think, why should I even come forward if I'm just going to be hated? At the end of the day, then that it seems that you just want revenge on this person. And so it comes from both perspectives, and it needs to be fostered from both perspectives.
Well, I think that's a good segue, particularly with social media and the broader media landscape. So I want to turn it over to Ivanka now and really ask her, what role does media play in promoting extremism, and what can be done to counter it by these new forms of media, particularly social media that Ruben was just talking about?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marek. Thank you. Thanks for having me. But first of all, let's address this word, the media. And when we talk about the media having the potential to promote misinformation or disinformation, extremism or hate, we can talk about the potential of traditional media, let's say such as newspapers, television, or radio, or new media or internet platforms to do so. And history has taught us that traditional media have been used to spread hate, and some of the examples include, let's say, the Nazi propaganda during the Second World War, or incitement of genocide during the conflict in Rwanda. In today's context, though, in some countries, we talk a little bit about the role of sensational tendencies to provoke emotional responses and support populist discourse and polarize audiences. And in some other instances, in other countries, we talk about the use of traditional media for pure propaganda purposes or hate speech. However, when we talk about the role of promotion of extremism and disinformation in the media, we primarily worry about internet platforms as main enablers of false narratives. They have the biggest reach and enable false and extreme narratives to be spread with a great speed. So study after study actually shows that, for example, Americans are often exposed to false information and are also tricked by it. And in addition, false information is typically shared by more people and far more rapidly than true information. So extreme narratives on social media can be easily amplified and very quickly. And furthermore, the credibility of message sources is somewhat blurred on the internet, since anyone can create and disseminate content online. And all of this makes it hard for audiences to navigate information spaces online. And large share of Americans actually say that they're confused in an online environment. So instead of being this repository of knowledge, all of the sudden online spaces have become echo chambers in which users actually selectively expose themselves to messages with which they agree with. But once people get in one particular narrative, it's very hard to get for us to get them out, right? So research has shown that countering misperceptions is extremely hard. Confirmation bias plays a big role here, since people have a tendency to look for information that will confirm their pre-existing beliefs. And people are also less likely to recognize bias in the information that matches their attitudes. And they often overestimate their own ability to spot false information. So they will think it would be easy for them to spot false information, which is usually not the case. So having all this in mind, there are several things that we can do. It's a complicated environment and extremely hard to navigate, but there are several things that we can do. And some of your previous panelists during your previous panels have talked about the need to for government's regulation of social media. And in addition to that, for further self-regulation by social media companies. And social media have already taken some of the steps. For example, they have taken down some of the extremist messages, and they try to include signals of source quality, fact-checking, although this has backfired in some instances. So what else can we do? They could, let's say, adjust their modeling for increasing engagement to promote quality information, and reduce, let's say, personalization of political and other information. Second, I think it's extremely important to empower individuals to be able to recognize false information online. And we can do that by media literacy programs in schools, universities, but also outside of formal educational settings. We could provide individuals with a set of tools to be able to look at the characteristics of certain messages online, which would provide them with cues to recognize biased messages, but also to let them know about our psychology, some individual variables that make us susceptible to believe information, false information that they would encounter in an online space. So in other words, to make people aware what are the characteristics of biased messages, false messages, or extreme messages, but also to teach them about their own vulnerabilities, also about the vulnerabilities of their social, political, or historical contexts that can maybe help them navigate the online space. I would also echo what your previous panelists have said, and that is that it's extremely important to promote personal contact and interpersonal contact among people, because that helps burst bubbles in which people easily get into rabbit holes. I think personal contact might help in that. And just to increase global cooperation between governments, researchers, and internet platforms. So far, they have been somehow separated, but if they merge, I think global efforts would be more fruitful.
Well, and I think this is a great segue into our second question is really this broader question of the role of dis, and malinformation. And we'll go around the horn again. And really maybe the question is, what role does dis, and malinformation play in the spread of extremism, and how do we address it? And so maybe for each panelist, if you could talk more about social media's contribution to the spread of dis, and malinformation as it relates to the rise of extremism. So Mubin, I don't know if you have anything you want to address on that question.
Oh, I sure do. Yeah, there's a quote that I'll never forget. I don't know who said it. I tried to track it down. I didn't know where it came from, but it goes media. And again, just based on what Ivanka was saying about like what do we mean by media? But media gives terrorism a longevity it might not otherwise enjoy. Media gives terrorism a longevity it might not otherwise enjoy. If you look at the development even of media, you can go back to the 80s, when the IRA was active in, committing terrorist acts. At that time, the government would go to the broadcaster and say, look, we don't want you to share this story, or we want you to change this or whatever. And it could be done at that time. Obviously, that can't be done nowadays, but at least there was a way in which that narrative could be impacted, controlled, if you will. However, of course, with the advent of social media, where it was no longer a one-way journey or one-way trajectory, meaning, broadcasters, was really a top-down approach. They created stuff, they were the platforms, they just delivered that messaging, and people just consumed it. Then, of course, with the advent of social media, it changed. Now, the consumer could become the producer of this information. And so even if I look back into the way in which, different platforms have been used, I can look back to really the mid 90s, even kind of dating myself, but so I'm a Gen Xer, right? So, we lived in the time when there was no internet, back when the dinosaurs were still around. But in the 90s, there were CDs that started to circulate. At that time, I remember consuming the Russian Hell series, and that was based on the fighting that was happening in Chechnya with the Russian regime. I can still remember, and every time I mention this, it just shows you how obviously the memory works. I remember seeing my first beheading video, right, in the late 90s. And then obviously in the early 2000s, with especially the war in Iraq, and Abu Musab Zarqawi and his crew, the kind of material they were producing. So the Nicholas Berg beheading video, that was another one. So what's happened is, and this is, a story as old as human civilization itself. Everything that we come up with, any invention or whatever, that we expect to be used for the greater good, has been used for bad. You can actually even go back to when the telegraph, was being used. Even that was being weaponized by different groups, rebel groups, and others, to put their messaging out. So, and again, just one last thing, even just following the chronology of from the 90s to the early 2000s to the late 2000s, I was watching in real time as ISIS was using Twitter and Facebook. Between the years of 2012 and 2018, I pretty much didn't have a life. I was just online, following and watching and engaging in even debates with ISIS members, Al-Qaeda members. Oftentimes, it didn't work out because I was this known government agent. So, of course, when you talk about, the messenger, and the messenger's credibility goes a long way as well. Many times I was just, of course, attacked and blocked and whatever else. But other times people were curious and did want to have that conversation with me. And I was able to even pull some people out of ISIS just based on online chatting with them. So the adversary will, of course, use whatever tools are at their disposal. Now we're talking about deep fakes. We're talking about AI generated information. I think the US military just did a thing where they had President Biden speaking, and he was basically speaking in 5 different languages. And it's not President Biden speaking in 5 languages, but it just shows you. And I think many of us have seen the Tom Cruise deep fakes as well. And while entertaining and humorous at times, you can see how it can very easily be weaponized by individuals. I think one of the deep fakes was used of President Zelensky in Ukraine, basically calling on Ukrainians to lay down their arms and give up, basically. So we will see terrorists using these technologies as soon as they become familiar with it and competent with it. And again, this is just it's par for the course. Whatever tools that we come up with, whatever platforms, technology, they will also use it. Just one last point in terms of what we can do. I think we also need to create some more pressure on social media companies. It's inexcusable and unacceptable that these companies, they make gajillions of dollars, and they can't spend the money. They need to spend the money. We need to force them to spend the money. I think they won't do it of their own accord. When we live in a system where it's all about the bottom line, it's all about profits, we lose the human touch in all of that. And so there needs to be more efforts by social media companies to hold themselves responsible and to realize that your platforms cannot be used to do these things. I mean, you have just seeing what I saw on Twitter and Facebook with ISIS and others recruiting in real time, doing all these things in full view of everyone. And then we're having discussions on whether deplatforming works or not. I mean, I can tell you that, yeah, a lot of these individuals would create fake accounts after they had been blocked. And, they would come up with, back after suspension, account number 14, die in your rage, O Kufar. Right. Well, yeah, they tried, but they kept getting bumped off. I mean, yes, there was some activity by social media companies to deplatform them, and it did work. And a lot of them did go offline. But then that created a whole other scenario of now they're in the dark. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing, who they're talking to, and so on. So this is the back and forth and the balance that we're going to need to strike if we're going to do anything about this.
Well, and I think this link with Islamic extremism, domestic extremism, foreign interference from various forms of propaganda kind of link together. And Todd, you've done research on all of these topics. And what are your insights on the role of dis and malinformation with extremism, and how do we address it based on your research?
Yeah, I love the comments from Ivanka and Movin. I'll just echo, social media is playing a huge role in a lot of this stuff. And, it does this in a couple different ways. One, the algorithms themselves prioritize a lot of this content. I think as Frances Hogan, the whistleblower from Facebook, aptly showed in her testimony last year, Facebook changed their algorithms in 2018 to prioritize, essentially to prioritize content that has high numbers of shares. And that ended up raising sort of the anger level on Facebook, which ultimately had a direct impact on how politicians responded, because they needed to use anger to get their content higher profile on Facebook. There's clickbait farms that play into this. Obviously, there's echo chambers, and I think the echo chambers do a couple things. Is the role of Facebook groups allow people to connect with each other. And it's not just being exposed to the propaganda or being exposed to disinformation content. It's being exposed to the relationships that the platforms enable. And I think a lot of radicalization research has shown that relationships with other extremists are really key in fomenting radicalization. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done to address this. One, and Ivanka mentioned some of these, there are interventions that can be done online to help. There are the data has shown very conclusively that corrections, either real-time corrections, crowdsourced fact-checking, algorithmic tagging, that has an impact on people's beliefs in misinformation. So in other words, you can correct this content as they see it, and it helps. Google just came out with a video that shows that they can pre-bunk content. So it's basically a video that shows people how adversaries, how malicious groups use disinformation. It educates the audiences, and based on that, those individuals, number one, they feel more empowered. Two, they're less likely to consume this stuff. So that plays into it. And of course, media literacy interventions help. And then of course, there's just going to be regulation that's going to have to happen on the platforms. We need more transparency on these platforms to know what type of content to know what their algorithms are, what their moderation policies are, and things like that. They're probably, obviously, we want them to remove the false content, but that gets into a challenge when you're dealing with right-wing groups and others who feel concerned that they're being targeted, which is, of course, a legitimate concern that they can have. And so that needs to be addressed, and of course, changing the algorithms so you're not prioritizing this content. But it's a long road because the algorithms make the money. So I think, as we've seen with Facebook, they're really going to be reluctant to make those changes. Over.
So let me hand it off to Ivanka here, where maybe you've talked about this a little bit earlier, but maybe you can expand on it based on your work on this role of misinformation and extremism, particularly as it relates to social media. What are your thoughts on that? Where do you see things standing today, and where are they headed?
Thanks, Mark. So yes, I'm just going to piggyback on Todd's thoughts about algorithms and echo chambers. I already talked about the impact on social media, but yeah, we know from the literature on selective exposure, from research on selective exposure, that people already are selecting the messages and selecting the information that they will consume online. That information usually matches their previous beliefs, their attitudes, something that they already believe in. They're going to look for similar information. They're going to look for something that will confirm what they already think, right? And the use of algorithms doesn't really help. It only makes this rabbit hole deeper for people. If they are already by themselves looking for this information, and then they're suddenly being fed again with more like-minded information that really doesn't help. And from the research in our field, we know that the perception of truth increases if the misinformation is repeated, right? The more we repeat the misinformation, the more we perceive it as being truthful. Also, exposure to similar content, and if you're always exposed to similar content, that creates identities, right? And once you create your identity as a member of a group or a particular ideology, that's really, really hard to counter, and that's really, really hard to burst when you get into that stage of life, right? If you create the identity based on certain ideologies or beliefs. Yeah, I think those are particularly important issues that we need to deal with.
Well, before we go to the next question, I just want to kind of ask Todd and Ubin this question about identity and your views on the role of identity and how you could potentially, shape that identity and trying to get people out of these extremist movements.
Yeah, I'll let me just jump on that. I even for me personally, when I went through my own radicalization journey, I ended up realizing that it was that sense of identity that was impacting me, particularly acutely. Coming from an Indian family, Muslim, born and raised in Canada, went to Quran school in the evening time, went to public school during the day. And the two were a night and day difference, right? One was an austere environment. We were beaten, we were put in stress positions. Compare that to public school, which was like boys and girls mixing, very caring, nurturing environment. And so it was like already building that identity crisis that, well, which way am I supposed to go? Society's pulling me this way, culture and community is pulling me another way. And I think this is one of the most common and most prevalent factors when it comes to radicalization into extremism or violence. Certainly, I mean, I've seen this, especially in the Muslim context, where people have this austere version of Islam, where you're supposed to live this particular life, but then you're living in the West, and it's very, very difficult, and it's one of the reasons why you see people go from seemingly they're living a very Western life, hedonistic life even, and then they just completely pull a 180 and go to the other extreme. As well, in terms of, so that's just my personal experience, but then even what I've discovered in talking to young people who are similarly going through this, again, the identity piece is a very, very important one. And so I think especially when we do these interventions and talking to young people and trying to get them out of it, building that healthy identity is going to be very important. Especially in the American context, I think the Americans are pretty good with with this idea is like, no, we're Americans, this idea of being united in that national identity. And sometimes it's just reminding people that, yeah, there are a lot of problems in the world, right? A lot of places that, are having issues or whatever else, but where would you rather be, considering where you are now? Very anecdotal, this one kid that we're dealing with, 21 years old, white kid, convert, got caught up in a sting operation, was supposed to go and join ISIS. A white kid, I mean, he's American, and yet he doesn't feel like he's a part of the society. He doesn't want to be a part of the society, or at least that's where he was. And then he's in a prison now. He's in a detention center. And I reminded him that, if you were caught in, and he was just, expressing his grievances about his current, state of accommodations, if you will. I reminded him that if you were caught up in this sort of stuff in one of those Muslim countries, Arab countries, they would be hanging you upside down from the wall, from the ceiling. This is what one of the things they do. They hang you upside down, and then they tell you, okay, now face Makkah and pray. Now you're in an American prison, kufar, all that stuff, sure, but you're getting all your meals. They change their schedules when it's Ramadan and it's time for you to fast, and when you get your food and all that, you have a prayer mat. They give you a Quran. You have so many rights, even though you're in this unfortunate situation. But compare that to if you were somewhere else. So just a conversation like that reminded him. He actually paused and thought, yeah, you know what? It's so much worse over there. And so my conditions might not be as bad as I think. So just building that identity again, and to kind of remind the person that this is a society in which you have all these opportunities, even in prison. I mean, the kid's gonna end up doing a degree in something, right? So that identity piece, I think, is one of the most important and certainly most prevalent factors when dealing with at least that radicalization process.
Well, I just say props to movement for being able to work that. In my view, like, identity is like the biggest glue that holds a lot of these people to these views. I mean, the identity, you like in our interviews, these people were like empowered by these groups, right? They were somebody. They grew up being nobody, having a lot of high rates of mental health problems, social stigma, bad relationships, and now they're somebody, and they got power, and people are scared of them. And that's very powerful. And they have these relationships that they never had before. So I don't know. I think working it from the identity angle is certainly challenging.
Well, I think this is a good segue in what we do. What should we do about this? And so we have some questions coming in. I want to encourage everyone to please start drafting up questions, because we're eager to answer them. But the last question we have, just for the moderated portion of this activity, is really, what advice do you have for communicators who are interested in countering extremism, particularly as it relates to misinformation in social media? So we'll go back. Mubin, what advice would you be giving to communicators?
Yeah, it's a good question. And everybody is going to come at this from their perspective, right? Their field, their area of study, their experience, whatever it is. And this is what we need to understand, is everybody has a part to play. All right. There's not going to be a one-man show. There's not going to be a single person who's going to be able to cover all angles. So let us focus on whatever lane that we're in, and just, excel at what we're doing. Okay. Just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, obviously there may need to be, an informational process. So for example, I had this crazy idea, when the whole counter messaging thing was happening, and how do we counter message ISIS and all that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of back and forth with that, and journal articles questioning whether it's effective or not. But I just thought to myself, you have colleges, universities in which you have media programs and things like that. Schools could very easily, and instructors, teachers, professors can give like school assignments, basically, on counter messaging. Pick a topic, pick an angle that you want to come at this with, work it into your current curriculum, and you're actually now applying the topics that they're learning. There's a lot of opportunities for that to be able to be done. Sure, there are pitfalls. You don't want to be sending students off onto the internet and just starting to have debates with neo-Nazis or jihadists. There obviously have to be limits. So schools can do things. and let's kind of work it from the macro to the micro, right? Macro level, societal institutions, so educational institutions, health institutions, coming at from a health perspective. From that level, you can bring it down, of course. If you bring it down to the micro level, that's where you have the one-on-one approach and methods and methods of communication, right? How you talk to individuals. It's difficult. I mean, believe me, it has been a learning experience for me as well. I wanted to fight them. I was like keen on getting in there and arguing with them and debating with them. But at the end of the day, what did I find? I found myself, I was like high anxiety, high stress. I was taking all this stuff in, and whether you like it or not, it's going to impact you. So I switched my tactics. I had this approach where I was like hyper aggressive, then I was like passive aggressive, and I was very passive. And really I found that I had more, more bites, if you will, with the almost a passive aggressive approach. So I'd say something, harsh, but then I'd like backtrack it. And then I'd want to be, come personal with the individual. So it's difficult. It's difficult to talk to people who have these abhorrent views, and they might be swearing at you and throwing these abhorrent views in your face. How you respond to that is vital. So understanding that this is where the person comes from, maintaining that balance of not being patronizing and condescending as well. This happens with my kids all the time. I try to be, nice and whatever, but then it's like, oh, you're patronizing, you're condescending. So it's tough, but to be centered and grounded and understand that what your objective is and learning what words to use, the tone of your voice, how you're going to give them practical things that they can. And I'll just close with this. I was doing the heavy theological approach, especially with the Al-Qaeda, ISIS types, which I do think still works and is still valuable. But when you bring that practical element to them, what is actually going to work for you in your life? It's like Todd was saying, and what he learned from the report and the study and the research. It's a hard life to be like this, and if you can just encourage that person to have an iota of self-awareness, that's going to go much further than anything else. And let me just jump to my messages here, because I had to. Here we go. So it goes, mocking or debating fanatical extremists online is not a challenge. The challenge is getting them to exhibit even one iota of self-awareness. And one last quote from James Baldwin. I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense that once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. So that's what we need to foster. And that's what we need to be aware of when we're engaging in these types of communications, whether it's at the macro level or at the micro.
Well, what I really like about your answer personally, Mubin, is this idea that there is this connection between these macro level forces and these interpersonal relationships that are forming, particularly the hardships in people's lives. And I think this actually ties back into Todd's research that you were working with him on the importance of these interpersonal relationships. So turning it to Todd for a moment, how can these relationships help address the spread of dis, and malinformation and extremism? And what advice would you have for communicators on kind of confronting these relationships?
So I think of it in different levels. Like, it depends on, from the communicator's perspective, who you're trying to work with. Do you have a friend or family member that is suffering from this? I mean, it's easy to like never spend Thanksgiving with them again, right? I mean, that's too easy. But if there's ways, again, as Movement was saying, to build a relationship, to find opportunities to talk, to avoid antagonizing them, and then look for avenues, then that's helpful. The second part is, are you dealing with people online? And there's a really good called the Debunking Handbook that, there's a model for how you can engage with people online. Say someone in your network is sharing, stupid fake news or whatever, right? So there's basically a 4-step model. 1, you state the truth in your response. 2, you point to the misinformation very briefly, but you point to it. 2, you explain how. 3, you explain how it's false. And 4, you repeat your truth again. And there's decent evidence that suggests that type of engagement over time, can be helpful. And I think the next thing I'll talk about is from the perspective of brands. There's a lot of disinformation content that's on websites that are getting a lot of ad dollars. And a lot of companies don't know where their ad dollars are going. They know it's going to Google, but Google and other platforms are placing those ads that people are paying for on sites that are promoting vaccine hesitancy, that are promoting racism, they're attacking Ukraine, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's really key to know where your ad dollars are at. There's an organization called Global Disinformation Index. I think they're a helpful resource. They've sort of ranked like thousands of websites according to this content, and they help brands audit their ad buys. So I think that's really key. So I'll sort of leave my recommendations at that.
Well, let's turn it back to Ivanka for a moment and kind of shift back up to this macro level for a quick second. In your opinion, Ivanka, what role does trust in the media play in all of this? Is there too much or too little trust in your opinion? And what can communicators do about it?
Thanks, Mark. Well, I think trust in media on the macro level plays a crucial role here. We know that the more you trust or perceive some information as credible, the more you're likely to share it with other people or even to behave in accordance with the message, right? And that actually doesn't matter whether the message includes misinformation or disinformation or any kind of propaganda. If you think it's credible, if an individual thinks the message is credible, they are more likely to share. So it's important to know how trust works, right? Even with messages that contain misinformation. Again, here media literacy plays a crucial role. I'm going to be repeating this, and both of other panelists are repeating this, that how much it is important to educate people to recognize biased messages or extreme messages, to recognize what's priming, what's framing, what's emotional content that plays on their emotions rather than on facts. What's confirmation bias, how it works on the individual level, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that's extremely important. When you ask me, do we have too much or too little trust and what's better? Like my answer is like very often in social sciences, it depends. It depends where and in which context, right? On the macro level, if you look at the American society, right, at the United States, we can say, and we have research that shows that trust in media has declined, right? So Americans are generally less trustful of institutions, news media included. However, that has to be unpacked a little bit, because if you take at various groups, we can say that various groups are trust different sources. So let's say Republicans and the Democrats, they trust their sources. But on average, if you look whether they trust news media as institution, you can see levels declining. So that's an interesting situation that we are in this country particularly. So they trust their own sources, but they don't trust overall the institution of news media. So I think that's very important to unpack these different levels of trust and how they work in understanding how and why trust is important, right? So there is not one unique answer.
And if I'm a communicator calling in, like, what can I, in your opinion, what can I do about it as a communicator in terms of addressing these issues surrounding trust? There
are several issues that research has found that might help. Personal connections again help. Research has shown, although people people's trust in news media is declining, they're more likely to trust, let's say, a particular TV station if they know the journalist. Or if they think that the journalist cares about the community they live in. So you'll see that some numbers in trust differ when you look at whether people trust local TV stations versus national TV stations. There's this local connection, the perception that local TV stations, let's say local media in general, they care more about local communities. So again, there's this stress on personal connection, whether the journalist is part of the community, whether there is a perception the journalist is part of the community, whether there is a perception the journalist is part of and works in the best interest of the audiences. There's also some research that has shown that if news media explain the process of their news production, that increases trust in traditional news media. So there is, those two things have worked so far.
Well, and I think I want to stop for a moment and actually bring up some questions that we're getting. The first one I'll raise is from Mitchell Cohn. Mitchell asked, is it better for the person who's trying to counter message to have formally been part of that group that is being targeted? Or does someone who has never been part of it even get listened to? Which I take that to mean, if you've never been part of it, can you be effective in trying to kind of counter this? So you had a response, Mubin, and maybe you want to elaborate on it or give a summary of it.
Yeah, just for those who may not be. So I said each of the two have their value. Sometimes the former member is taken seriously, sometimes not. Same for the non-former. If both can be active at the same time, that's ideal. But the main thing here is that the person who is seeking to change the view is a trusted intermediary. And I say here, find out who they are to the person and engage them as a primary intervener. And trusted intermediary, that's like I think the key to it all. It can go either way, right? For some people, the former is not good. It could, for whatever reason, right? They may have been perceived to have sold out the group or become a traitor to the group, and so they're useless in terms of being able to intervene. But really, it's to find out who is that intermediary, the trusted intermediary. It could be a family member, but sometimes the family member could be the cause of the person's grievances, so they're not going to be good in that sense. So it's talking to them and realizing that trying to identify like who are the people that they look up to, or at least who are not in the group, right? It could be anybody, a religious leader, a school teacher, somebody from their past, that we might kind of reintroduce them to. These are all elements that we're using, in that case I gave you of that white kid, ISIS convert. There have been people that have been reaching out to him because the parents have been very involved, and the parents have kind of looked into their kids, their child's past, and who did this person, connect with and was good with. And so to reintroduce them into the person's life, that's the approach that we want to take in this context.
Well, Todd, that kind of aligns with what you were finding in your work, right?
Well, I mean, I'll say that you have to go beyond just extremists, because there's no way to scale the solution to this space. And I know that there's an interesting, Moonshot is an organization that specializes in online interventions. There's some construction going on here, so I hope you can't hear that. But they specialize in online interventions, and what they'll do is they buy ad space on Google. So if someone searches, how do I join KKK or how do I join ISIS? They get put an ad in front of them. And what they've actually done some testing to show that a lot of people who search for this extremist content are actually more likely to search for content offering online counseling than people who don't search for extremist materials. So these people, and we know that a lot of people with extremist views have like past mental health issues. So anyway, they're doing work funneling these people to connecting them via Google to counseling to help them. And they're finding that I think their initial results are these counselors can do pretty well talking to these people about their issues, and it provides an opportunity for engagement. So anyway, no, you don't need to be an extremist to work with these folks.
Well, and I think that's a good point, Todd, because there's this issue of trust and extremism writ large. And I think, Ivanka, you've talked about a bit, is this trust in the media, right? And trust in local media. So what are your thoughts on kind of the media's role in all of this?
Yeah, trust in the media, or trust in local media, trust in national media, but also trust in the message itself, right? What we do in our research is trying to identify factors which impact our trust in news media in general, but also in messages in particular, any kind of messages, right? And we found a lot of factors, individual plus the message factors that are embedded in the message itself that impact trust in news media in general, and in messages in particular. But again, what's important, and I don't want to talk for hours here about the factors that we found, but what's important is to understand that people, if they perceive messages credible, it doesn't matter whether it's misinformation or disinformation, they will act upon it in a certain way in terms of sharing or doing even things like some other things, right? So it is important to educate. And it also, like in our research, when we look at how important trust is, right? We want people to be critical thinkers and to critically assess the messages that they are receiving, right? So on a scale that we use for trust, we don't like to see complete distrust, right? But we also don't like to see absolute trust. Why? Because, complete distrust in the, let's say, media system as a whole or in institutions is not good for democracies. It's not sustainable, right? The democracies, they rely on trust. They rely on social cohesion. So that there has to be an amount of trust. On the other hand, absolute trust, right, is not good at all, because then you are not able, an individual is not able to maybe perceive some deceitful messages, right, that they encounter online in all aspects. So a form of what we call healthy skepticism is good, that will allow individuals to be skeptical to a healthy degree, to critically assess the messages, to look for bias in them, but at the same time, be able to trust the system as a whole, right? And at the same time, also be able to monitor the work of the government and also and the work of people in power, right? So this dose of healthy skepticism, I think we should cultivate, and I think we should approach when designing some programs that could help audiences discern biased messages.
Well, let's segue to government for a second, because there was a great question by Edward Cole, who asked, why has the government been so slow to govern social media? And by government, that means US government, Canadian government, British government, so on and so forth. So Edward's point is that it seems like the intelligence community and other government entities have really kind of been, they know that these growing risks exist. Was there a failure? Where does that failure exist today, if it still does? And what do we do about it? So maybe I'll kick it to Todd first and foremost. What's up with the government in the US and abroad?
Well, there's established law in this Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically limits platform liability for these things. There's been a lot of talk of regulation for these platforms, but I think it's the same issue that's affecting almost anything that affects Congress, right? I mean, there's a lot of lobbying efforts from the platforms to avoid regulation. There are some legitimately different partisan viewpoints on the value and importance of regulation. And of course, there's a lot of disagreement about what the problem is. Some conservatives view the platforms as being too much targeting right-wing audiences, and those on the left think the platforms aren't targeting enough right-wing audiences. So I think it's just sort of classic moribund Washington is at play on this.
I mean, what do you think about in Canada, Mubin? Like, what are your thoughts? Because I mean, the US and Canada, in many ways are similar, but in other ways there are differences. And what's the government in Canada been doing, and what have they not been doing that they maybe should be doing?
Yeah, there have been some conversations on this. First of all, was I think it was called the Christchurch call, or it was obviously after what happened in New Zealand there at the mosque, and how those videos were shared, and the attack videos were shared. And I can understand from the social media platform perspective. At any given moment, I mean, there are just millions of pictures and videos and comments that are being posted. It's impossible. I mean, even if you had machines doing it for you, you could not keep up with the volume of information that's being put out there. So there is that reality that we all have to deal with. So that's one part of it. There was this, like I said, Christchurch call, this idea to monitor social media platforms, especially hate speech. I mean, hate speech is illegal. And so if there's illegal activities happening on these platforms, clearly there is room for government to kind of make them take stuff down. And so that's one thing. The second thing is the Canadian government announced the creation of a counter disinformation function, primarily to push back against Russian disinformation. And we were talking earlier about just the role of dismiss and malinformation and extremism, and for a while, and it was at least traced back to Russian accounts. They were creating like fake Black Lives Matter Facebook pages. They were creating fake Muslim Facebook pages, antagonizing people, making like, the Muslims are coming to get you, or BLM's coming to get you, or whatever it was. So, the adversary is certainly using these platforms to our detriment. It's harming society. There must be some kind of responsibility from government, and I mean, I can only let you guys figure out how you're going to do that on your side, and then we're doing the same thing on our side, trying to figure out what is that balance. We value freedom of speech. Obviously, we don't want. I mean, it's not illegal to be a racist. So, how are you going to tell people that? How are you going to force social media companies to stop racism, for example? It just, I don't see that as a realistic proposal and proposition. But the other stuff, when we're talking about things that are clearly illegal, there's room for that, right? I mean, law enforcement and social media companies have liaison offices, and they do this work every day, all day. But it's that middle space, right? It's not criminal, but it's abhorrent. What do you do about that? And social media companies are private organizations, right? They can do, in one sense, the government can't do what they're doing, and they can't do what the government does. But we cannot just leave it with this disconnect and just let people do as they see fit, because the harm that it's creating to society, stochastic terrorism, people are laying the breadcrumbs for others to then pick up, and then they end up becoming violent. These are things that we have a responsibility, not just morally, not just legally, but just, from the perspective of society. I mean, look what it's doing to society. It's dividing people. It's breaking families apart even, so something needs to be done. I mean, let's figure out what that is.
I will say, I'll add on, it was much easier when you had the Muslim boogeyman at play in this, because the platforms worked pretty well to counter ISIS. There was a period of time where they were trying to figure out what to do, but they were able to remove that content relatively quickly. There was a lot of political will to do it. Everybody was in favor of it. America was united against it. And it's just not that way with the far right stuff. Number one, it's connected to a legitimate political movement, not directly, but indirectly. And so there's concerns about countering conservatism online, even though this stuff is not classic conservatism, but still. So that plays into it. Obviously, what Movement said, it's okay to be a racist. It's legally okay to be a racist. It's legally okay to espouse racist content, where it wasn't really to be supportive of a foreign terrorist organization. So, these politics play into it in a big way.
Well, we're getting a ton of great questions. I want to encourage everyone to please do not hold back in entering your questions. But before we continue to the next question, I want to ask Ivanka if she has any comments, because you teach undergraduate and graduate courses on these topics related to trust. So do you have any comments on the government's lack of regulation and how the government should be approaching this in terms of social media?
All right, thanks. It's always a slippery slope when you talk about government interventions, especially in the United States. So there are some countries in which governments have, regulated the space of internet space, right, to a greater extent. But I would leave it really, on the other hand, like what Mubin is saying is absolutely correct. This is harming people. This is harming families. And I think I would leave it to the legal experts to go a little bit further in this, what can be done in terms of regulations, the existing regulations, and maybe some new regulations that could help us deal with this problem.
Well, I want to turn now to a question from Jim Simon. And I think he makes a great point where he really notes that recent polls, including the Edelman Trust Barometer, have shown that business is more trusted in some cases than government and the media. So his question really is, what can big business in particular do to counter some of this, misdis malinformation? And I would just add to that is there a place in the marketplace for competition to maybe potentially be a forcing function for some of these social media companies? Who wants to take the first bite at that?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one. Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. You have marketing agencies and companies that are they have the competency in-house to do a lot of this stuff. For example, when the whole ISIS thing was happening and everyone was like wowed by the production value of those videos, yeah, compared to, you know, grainy Al-Qaeda videos or Taliban videos, ISIS videos were, of course, very modern, because a lot of the individuals that went and ended up joining ISIS were young people who were trained and educated in the West and gave and put forward their skills in service of that organization. So I thought to myself, how is it possible with the minds that we have in the US, in Hollywood, that nobody could come up with a counter video to that? I couldn't imagine. Like, this doesn't make sense to me. And then there were some attempts even in the Middle East to produce content, TV commercials, which was with specific messaging. I think Moonshot was involved in some of that stuff, some pretty good stuff that was being put out there. But, you know, there needed to be more of that, right? So media or marketing companies, you know, whether it's clothing company or whatever it is, they can do things. You know, I can still, you know, Benetton, remember the ads of Benetton? You know, I loved that stuff. I mean, it was very positive. It was groundbreaking, really. I mean, not many other companies were doing that, like being very open about not being racist and things like that. There have been some attempts, like in the UK, I think there were some TV commercials that were put out there, basically trying to develop this social cohesion. Like one clip, if I can just describe it, was, you know, this brown bearded guy, he's got this bag over his shoulder, he's walking, this white woman with her kid is walking by and very suspicious of him, and he's going, and finally he leans down towards, you know, I think it was like a homeless person or something, and he opens up the bag and he's got a stethoscope because he's a doctor, right? Things like that to kind of show you, oh, wow, like how I had it so wrong. So there are things that can be produced. One of the things that we're trying to do, at least, or I'm trying to do through Parents for Peace, and we're trying to kind of build up the connections, is engaging entertainment icons, right? Other countries have done this as well, using sports figures to give positive messaging, pro-social messaging. But I really want to see, even in the entertainment field, having content produced, like making songs, making albums that relate to these sorts of topics, and kind of bringing back that social awareness back into the music. If I can be, you know, if I can be a nerd like that, go back to things that you know, speak to what people are going through and things like this. I mean, again, if I can just kind of, like, I hate the current state of rap, for example. I mean, the old classical rap was good stuff. There was some good stuff, but like now, like, it's just, you know, it's just garbage, right? That's being put out there. And I want some of these you know, entertainers to realize that they have a lot of social value, and things that they say can go a long way, far further than anything that government could produce. So I think those are things that we need to exploit in a positive way.
I want to ask Todd this question, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for one of your works, Todd, Enlisting Madison Avenue, which is a great piece of work. But you've been thinking about this for some time, not only with extremism, but also with Russian disinfo and extremism in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on the role of big business, either taking the lead or practices that we can port over from what they've been doing?
Well, one thing, I mean, I'm thinking about is just business need to tread carefully and subtly in this space, especially if we're talking about countering far right or right-wing extremism. Then I think they need to be somewhat subtle. I'm already hearing some put the word big business in the same sentence as liberal Hollywood, liberal Silicon Valley, and universities, right? So I don't think a business wants to get branded that way. But they do obviously have a lot of credibility on the plate. I think doing stuff like what Mubin is talking about makes sense, but doing it subtly, not attacking the ideology directly, but maybe showing it the integration piece, countering stereotypes. I think that all can be helpful. I think to the extent that governments are playing this, then they could learn lessons from how businesses work in this space. And that was sort of, you mentioned my Madison Avenue report. You know, that was all talking about lessons from big business, from commercial advertising for doing counterinsurgency operations. But I think even like there's just lessons that can be told there. And then just going back to what I mentioned previously about where they put their ad dollars, making sure their ad dollars are going to legitimate spaces. legitimate publications, legitimate outlets, and not funding disinformation.
Well, Ivanka, what do you think about this? Because I mean, is there more trust in big business? Should big business tread carefully, or should they just kind of delve in, feet first into this issue in terms of countering extremism and disinformation?
Right. First, we need to define big business, but okay. Let's make some assumptions. Hate is always directed, or usually directed, towards the outgroup members. Very usually, that's how it works, right? And extreme messages are, in a lot of cases, directed towards an outgroup, whatever that outgroup is, right? The building of the sense of identity in the in-group, and then projecting hate towards the outgroup. And those outgroups can be racial, can be ethnic, can be political, you name it. They can be, people will find different outgroups to project the hate to. And I think that as a human race, as a business or a university or media, any kind of or government, we need to fight stereotyping. We need to understand our differences, but also fight stereotypes, right? And understand different groups and how they function in the society that we live in, right? So as Mubin said, promote this social cohesion. Fight, to a certain extent, othering, right? There is this process that we call othering, when you perceive the other always as the other, not a part of your group, whatever the group is, but there is this other. Whoever the other is bad, we are good, right? This polarization between us and them is extremely harmful, and it has always been harmful. So I think promoting social cohesion in any kind of spaces, be it business or government or universities, I think we should, as a human race, do that more.
We have two great questions coming in here, and I want to get to the first one here, which is really on specific guidance for communicators. And so we had an anonymous attendee write this question: what guidance would each of you give to communicators who work for social media platforms? Given that the industry is creating many of these community managers, how can these community managers and folks who are connected with the social media platforms themselves fight dis and malinformation? What would you tell them, Todd?
It's hard to offer suggestions for what they can do on the inside. I know that there are a lot of good people that are working in this space, that are working for these platforms. There are a lot of those involved in the trust and safety divisions that are working on this. In terms of like community managers, are those the folks that are organized, that work with the Facebook groups and the like? Because I think the part of the key issue is just keeping people off these, trying to keep up to space with how some of these adversarial groups, the QAnon groups, the Stop the Steal groups, how these groups are organizing. I know, like on TikTok, for example, they've sort of banned the hashtag Stop the Steal, but then others create the hashtag Stop the Steal with multiple L's. I know that is happening on Facebook a lot as well. So these groups are getting banned and they're reorganizing. And I think trying to keep up with that is the challenge.
Well, and I want to clarify too that, let's think about these community managers for specific communities on the platforms, but there also are these communications managers who are working for the platforms as well too. So there might be these distinct roles we want to keep in mind that I just got a note from Shelley about, which is a great point. Mubin, do you have any other additional thoughts on the roles that those working on the inside, what they can do to fight this kind of content?
Yeah, it's tricky because they have their respective jurisdiction, if you will, and they have to work within that. And they do have, like Todd was mentioning, the trust and safety groups and law enforcement liaison organization units, I guess, within the company. I mean, they're limited in what they can do, right? I mean, other than just be vigilant in terms of, the policies and procedures they already have in place, and just to be strict in implementing them. That's really all they can do from the perch, that they're on. But the content is gonna do what it does, right? The groups are gonna mobilize and organize as they will, and there's not, for most of the time, you just got to watch it happening. But in that vigilance, where you see that there's a deviation from what your policies and procedures allows, get on it, right? Get on it and be vigilant, be strict with enforcing those existing policies and procedures. Changing the policies and procedures is going to happen many layers and levels above their pay grade. And I think that's where we need to focus.
I think the biggest issue is just the platforms are not resourcing this. I think Facebook is, I think they're sort of getting tired of a lot of this space, and so they're starting to divest in their trust and safety teams and things like that. So, it's hard to fight City Hall on a lot of these things, and if they're not investing in these groups, Facebook is divesting in CrowdTangle. The one platform that was used to help researchers understand what type of content was circulating on Facebook, and now they're divesting in that. They're divesting in some of their election integrity teams. So I think it's, like I said, it's hard to fight City Hall.
Ivanka, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, we can move on to another question.
I really don't, I don't want to be unfair to social media companies, since we don't know really well how they're structured from inside. What Todd is saying is discouraging, but I would just encourage them to work more, if possible, with universities. Crowdsourcing was one of the platforms that was CrowdTangle, sorry, was one of the platforms that helped researchers, right, do research on public Facebook profiles, right? So cooperate more with universities to design strategies. And maybe I don't know what their hiring structure is, and how many people are actually hired from engineering sciences, and how many people are hired from social sciences, and let's say journalism and content creation, right? So I would, merge those two, instead of looking them as separate. I would merge their efforts, right? That would be what I would add.
Well, I think this is a great segue in terms of how we hold these efforts accountable. And so Sean, and I'm going to butcher your last name, Sean, so forgive me, Sean Honaki, had a comment and a question, which are both insightful. His comment was really this issue of that these businesses don't always seem to be incentivizing counter disinformation efforts. And in some cases, the social media companies, their business model relies on this high engagement to amplify disinformation. So there's issues of incentives. But then he had a follow-up question I think is really, a great point that I want to open it up to the panel. How can we effectively balance accountability and justice with the listening approach that's needed to de-radicalize? So his point is that there seems to be this messaging needed around that. And he notes that, Mubin, your point was that, you want to have the victim perspective, touch on the victim perspective earlier, but there's also this tension when you're seeking truth and reconciliation. So for example, the heavy-handed approach also may not always work for de-radicalization, as noted above, but there also is this issue of how do you, and I'm going to, my thinking is, do we always need to have the listening approach, or do you need to have another approach as well too, particularly as it relates to social justice? I don't know if that makes sense or not. There's a lot there, but essentially I think my take is that there's a balance between the social justice and listening approach and other approaches for responding to de-radicalization.
Yeah, can I just quickly jump on that?
Yeah.
What I found was helpful is, especially when a person is just disengaging from the group and you're trying to put them on the path of de-radicalization, just because a person has, freshly left the group doesn't mean they're de-radicalized. It means that they've disengaged. There's a behavioral shift, but there may not yet be a full cognitive shift away from the group. And that's obviously the ideal. That's the goal. And that's obviously the hardest thing to do, right? If you can imagine, convincing somebody to switch political parties or to switch, sports teams, it's extremely, extremely difficult. So what I found is that it's to really reinforce to the person what that healing has to look like, and to tie into their journey that victim perspective as well. It's it kind of borrows from restorative justice as a justice model. And even with the case that I was talking about earlier of this domestic extremist group, where the guy kind of defected and is out, a lot of people they're skeptical. They have been, they've even come kind of trying to attack me, like you're laundering his image and this and that. I'm used to that stuff, so I can take it. Excuse me, but he's seeing it. The guy that we've gotten out, he's seeing it, and it's just cycling the anxiety and the stress within him, and it's kind of slowing that process of de-radicalization. So what I found is that to tie into the person's journey, making them realize that they are going to have to make amends. They're going to have to come back and deal with this. You don't have to deal with it right away. Just got to at least mention it to them at the outset, so that we know when we come to it, it's not a surprise. It has to be worked on slowly but surely. Especially that accountability piece is very important, because what we do is we tie true de-radicalization to that accountability. That once you take stock, once you take responsibility for what you've done, then you're set on a right path. And so what this guy did is he made a Twitter thread on what he was involved in. He's, my name is Brian, I've done this, I've done that. And he openly admitted the things that he did. He engaged in stochastic terrorism. He made life hell for a lot of people, hell. And he knows that. So admitting that, is a great first step for somebody from the perspective that he's coming from. And there are other personal issues that I'm aware of. It was a huge step for him to take, so that's how it is done, right? We tie that accountability piece into the de-radicalization. It cannot be separated. It really cannot be. And so I think that's the way, and it has to be done gently, kind of playing, reiterating what we were saying earlier about that one-on-one communication, and how you do it, and the tone of voice, and the words you use, and the trusted intermediaries that you bring to bear on all of this. One of the great things that came out of that was he was, cut off from his family because of, what he was involved with. But after he wrote that thread, his eldest daughter followed the account and shared the thread. And there are other members of the family that he's been making amends with as well. So it's almost like that ring model. Work on your immediate family members first that you need to get right with, and then start expanding that model. And then you'll get to your victims eventually. And so it has to be, tied together. Thanks.
What do you think, Todd, about this balance between
No,
accountability?
I can't add on what Movin said. I thought that was pretty good. I wouldn't even try and touch it.
Do you want to touch it, Ivanka?
No, just saying that maybe like we would need more research that Todd is doing, like understanding these communities, understanding the motivations of how people get engaged in this sort of community. So understanding the audience profiles of such communities and their motivations, I think that would be extremely valuable.
So I think this is a good segue. I don't think we have any other questions lined up at the moment, but maybe giving each of you just a quick kind of chance to wrap things up. And it's hard to follow what you just said, Movin, but maybe we'll start with you. And if you have any kind of last takeaways for communicators on what to do and steps forward and other words of wisdom.
No, look, like the academics will always tell you more research is needed, and it depends. And I love to hear that. And it's so true. I've kind of razzed the academics for a while, because I really consider myself a practitioner, but a pracademic. So we have to come from those perspectives. We need the academic piece to really, that deep, proper research that needs to go into this stuff. We're starting to scratch the surface. I think, the research that Todd has done, and is really, really important. And we need to expand that sample size, if you will. We need to talk to a lot more people. So let the academics do the talking as well and the research. But I think that practical aspect of it has to be done as well. We don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. I mean, there is a fire. Okay, there's no use for us to step back and let's look at the fire. What color is the fire? How hot is the fire? What's the building material that is burning? That's all good to know, but we need to put the fire out. We need to actually do stuff, and we're gonna get things wrong, and that's okay. These things are moving at a breakneck speed. It's changing at every moment, and we need to kind of try to match that level of dynamic response that we bring to that. So really all I can say is that we need to do more of what all of us are doing, and all of you who are participating in this event, I'm sure you are doing these things in your own way. And we just need to kind of collaborate and come together and realize that, okay, this is what you're doing in your space. How can we help you do what you're doing in that space? How can you help us do what we're doing in our space? We need to have a very open approach. None of us are going to solve the problem on our own. We are all students at the end of the day. We're always learning. We must, even for us personally, we must be open-minded and take in as much as we can, because this is the fight of the age. I mean, in the age of information, it's disinformation that's going to be the adversary. So let's get on it.
So we got
Thanks.
a couple minutes left, and I want to give Todd and Ivanka a quick moment just to kind of give their takeaways and steps forward.
Yeah, I love that notion of bringing communicators and other people who are in this space together. Because I could say communicators should do X, Y, or Z, but I think to be able to build a relationship, say, between organizations like Parents for Peace, or there are other organizations in this space, to bring them together with communicators and to build that conversation and to see what opportunities exist, I think would be amazing. But otherwise, thank you. Thanks, Shelley, for having us. Mark, for moderating.
Yeah, I want to give Ivanka one last little final word here real quickly before I hand it back to Shelley. Ivanka, do you have any final words of wisdom?
Thanks. I would agree with Mubin and Todd that this collaborative effort is extremely important. Also using what we do as academics, we often perceive that people who sit in some dark dens and write things that nobody ever reads. But that's not true, right? We are doing, like, we are, for example, we are in the College of Journalism and Mass Communication. We are doing research that has the effect of media on people, right? On their different variables, right? Individual variables. So, and we test communication theories. So in real world settings. So these things can be extremely valuable, I think, for communities. And I think the findings of our studies that we do in our college and across this country, they need to be communicated. And, these collaborative efforts between academia and professionals and the industry have to be, intensified. And thank you all for having us. Yeah, and thanks, Marek, and thanks, Shelley.
Well, I'm going to close out by thanking our distinguished panelists today, and also thanking those who called in, had questions, and were engaged. And finally, I really am excited to have RAND and the Museum of Public Relations working together. And I want to thank Shelley and all the staff at the Museum of Public Relations for spearheading this event with RAND. So with that, I will close out the event. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day and long weekend. Take care.